and I hope you've been enjoying the past sessions which we had in our foundation course. And today we are having a session by Rajgopal sir on medical ethics. So let's start the discussion. And if you have any questions or anything in between, please feel free to put in your chat. And please, if we can all have our screens on mute, so that will help, like everyone will be able to listen to what sir is saying very clearly, right? If you have any questions, we'll just take it up.
Doriya, Raju, thank you very much, and hello everybody once again. I usually, Doriya, I have to come here and ask everybody to give me a smile. But today, the smiles are there already. Asha has been ready with it for quite some time. So thank you, everybody. Hey, listen, ethics. I think I'll try to make it as much grounded in reality as possible. This is not going to be something based on what Westerners have written in their textbooks. Of course, that also, but also on the realities in our country. I'll share the screen now and show you an image of one of our patients. You see the woman lying in darkness in that hut, dilapidated hut, all bricks all coming away, just as her own body and mind are. Most of the time alone, on a straw mat. And we talk about the Constitution of India guaranteeing life with dignity. How old is that? 71 years? Life with dignity. Now, she somehow manages to live with dignity in her village. I mean, when we go to the villages, when we talk to poor people, especially in rural areas more than in cities, we are amazed at the quiet dignity that they live in. They have their own rules of conduct. City people are different, but in villages, most of them are scrupulously honest. And they'll keep their word, never break a promise. It's amazing. But what happens when she goes to your hospital, which can be a government hospital or a corporate hospital or a charitable hospital, anyway? People start insulting poor people, particularly poor people, right from the man standing there as security person. And this happens because she is weak. This may happen in her household also, with the family members. Gradually, as she is weak, people taking over her life, scolding her for not eating enough, and for maybe even not working enough. And when she goes to hospital, the power imbalance is huge. We have all the power available in our medical system. Shashikala and Chetan, you realize what I am talking about. Your white coat, your stethoscope, all the paraphernalia in the hospital. Dr. Ravindran, you would agree that this gives us a power which we will choose whether to abuse it or not. But without even knowing about it, there will be a tendency to abuse it. Wherever there is power, it tends to be abused. So, what do you think about the joke on the top about the Constitution guaranteeing life with dignity? Before I talk about the universal accepted international code of ethics, I am going to talk about a few things which are unofficial, not there as the basic fundamental principles of medical ethics or anything. It's something that I have to keep myself to keep telling myself to remember, because I also have that power. My medical knowledge gives me a power. My organization gives me a power, and I have to keep telling Rajagopal, be careful. You may abuse your power. When you abuse your power, you will treat people without respect. And this can be anywhere in any uh, context. Gajit Sajaj and Bharti and Jurgen are here in your capacities as participants. Of course, you are young people. I have a bald head, I have a gray hair, I have half a century of experience with me, and that will make me maybe stiffen my muscles and say, what is this? I will remember that woman and each one of you, whom majority I don't know, Nehal, Sneha, Sandeep, I don't know you, but I know that each one of you has something in you that is superior to me. It may be mental strength, it may be that you can draw or paint or sing, it may be 100 different things, but each one of you has something in you. Meera Prasad has something in her that I do not have. And I have to keep reminding myself that, so that I treat everybody with respect. I forget sometimes. Sometimes I forget, and especially when I am irritated, I tend to snap at others. But whenever I realize what I have done, I apologize to people. I'm human. Okay, so much about respect. A fundamental principle, if we are to respect the dignity of people, dignity of people, we have to treat them with respect, and we have to be non-judgmental. This is harder. Oh my God, this is really hard. This is hard. Asuprakash Shazia, are you able to say with confidence that you can be confident about not being judgmental when we are treating people? Suppose you know that your patient is a drunkard, beats up his children, beats up his wife, abuses his neighbors, and lives a horrible life, and then comes to you as a patient. Would you be able to treat him with respect, is my question. This is difficult. I myself find it sometimes challenging, but there are two things that I will remember. I'm sorry that I am talking things that those are out of the textbook, perhaps, or maybe it's there and I haven't seen it. But when I see somebody to whom I feel, hey, somewhere there I am starting to be judgmental, I will tell myself, I'm a doctor, I'm a human being, I am not a judge. Nobody gave me the authority to be a judge. One. Secondly, think about it. Who will be kind to him? I remember a man who had an amputation for a peripheral vascular disease. Nobody was with him. Eventually, when it was time for discharge, nobody came to get him. We rang up the post office, talked to the postman, and asked the family, if the family doesn't come, asked to talk to the Panchayat president. And you know what the Panchayat president told me when he rang me up? He said, aha, one limb is gone. Huh? Okay, if he comes back here, we'll break the other also. That was the kind of life we had. And I remember, if I do not have compassion to him, there will be nobody else in the world to give him compassion. So I have an added responsibility here to be compassionate to this person. Anybody wants to have a quick comment about that? Gauraya, I am on a slideshow, so I won't be seeing the chats. I'll depend on you to interrupt and bring up anything that is relevant.
Right, sir. So currently there are no chats, but sometimes this also happens in case of drug addicts, like those who are chewing tobacco for lifelong, and then they are getting oral cancers. And again, we have the same feeling when we treat such patients that all life they've been abusing drugs, and now they are here with cancer, and their family and others, they are again dragging after the patient. So even this scenario comes up in cases like these.
Thank you, Gauraya. Very valid. Very valid. So this is a hard lesson, I must tell you, because we are also human beings. Thank you, Gauraya. That was important. Next point, I have put in confidentiality here. This is particularly mentioned here because in the West, you may not have to say this, taken for granted, but here we forget it very often. Especially in palliative care, it's important because we go into the personal matters of the patient. Suppose she says she is often ridiculed and abused by her daughter-in-law. Suppose she says that. We may have to write it on the file so that everybody else knows what's happening and that she has this feeling. But what will happen in the family themselves come to know that she has been saying this? And I remember a woman having to leave her village because she had systemic lupus erythematosus. A Panchayat member, very kind and compassionate Panchayat member, asked the doctor, rang up the doctor and asked, hey, what does this girl have? I mean, she's all alone. Her husband has left her and she's living with her young children. They need her. What's wrong with her? The doctor said something about an autoimmune disease, etc. The Panchayat member got the word immune, and the next day it was spread in the village that the girl had AIDS. And she had to flee the village. But whatever that is, it is simply not right. As individuals, we may have to share confidential things with the rest of the team. Her welfare needs that. But as a team, we have to respect confidentiality. Now, in the context of dignity, does anybody know of a internationally famous name in the context of dignity? It is Harvey Chochinov. Harvey Chochinov did a lot of work on dignity. I mean, just look for dignity therapy. But not only from dignity therapy, what I have found with people is one thing of ensuring dignity, restoring lost dignity to the woman is to sit down with her and tell her, tell me about your life. When you say, tell me about your life, you are giving her the importance that she has as a human being. Somebody wants to know, somebody is interested in me, and they will bring up a lot of things. And then you say, with all those difficulties, you brought your children up. I have respect for your ability. If that's what you feel, genuinely. And in a woman who is now lying without the ability to look after herself, in whom not so loving family may have to do the daily activities of daily living for her, the fact that somebody acknowledges her worth as a human being is desperately important. That's also spiritual care. So I'll go on to the rest of ethics discussion after pointing out these 4 points, which I thought are fundamentally important for any healthcare provider: respect, non-judgmental approach, confidentiality, life review. And before I move on, let me remind you, the drunkard, the drug addict, as if drug addict is a crime. It's a disease. Science knows that it's a disease. genetically mediated and controlled by environmental factors, and you and I, with the same genetic and environmental factors, could have been an addict. So, whoever that is, we will remember that if we do not care for them, in the whole world, nobody else will. That's an opportunity given to us, enriching our lives. If you have any comments, you might bring it up now. If not, I will move on. These are the 4 fundamental, globally accepted principles of medical ethics: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. I'll describe it as distributive justice. Okay, somebody tell me, what is autonomy? Gauraya, let me try to get this from some participant. Somebody, quickly, what is autonomy? We don't have a lot of time. Unmute and speak or put in the chat. I'll put that one. We don't have a lot of time. Write our own self. This is my body. This belongs to me. I have more right over this than anybody else. What is beneficence? Anybody?
Do good.
Doing good. Okay.
Treatment
Very good.
which is beneficial to the patient.
Yeah. Doing good in every way. Not only medical treatment, your behavior, certainly medical treatment. Doing the best for the person. And what's non-maleficence?
Doing no harm.
Do no harm.
Not doing any harm. Okay. And where does justice come in? As I said, here we mean distributive justice. Equity in care. Remember, equity is not equal. Your patients do not require your time or the institution's money equally. That would be unfair. If somebody requires more time, you should give it to them. That is equity. There should be distributive equity. These are the 4 globally accepted principles of medical ethics. And that's great in theory. In practice, theory and practice are not the same. This is not what you see happening around you. In the hospitals where you have trained, in the community in which you live, autonomy is seldom respected. Beneficence, whose beneficence? And non-maleficence. We are living in a country where in 1 year, 55 million people are pushed below poverty line. And we are talking about beneficence and non-maleficence. And justice. How about the vulnerable population? Geographically isolated, different sexual orientation, disabled. Are we able to give them equitable care? So maybe this gives you, Vasuprakash and Shazia and Kanchan, and me the opportunity to do a lot. There is so much to be done. Her chances of getting ethical treatment, we'll have to agree, are not all that many. And will you now, Raju, can you orchestrate it? A group work for 5 minutes. You have to give your responses in 1 or 2 sentences about this question. How is autonomy violated? Beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. 1 or 2 important examples. Raju?
Sir, how many groups do you prefer, sir?
Usually the ideal group is 6 to 8. Depending on the number of people who have joined. How many are there?
We have around 40, sir.
40. So 5 groups will be perfectly fine.
Okay, sir. So just want to add in again, in the group, just find a leader. The leader need to take down all the points discussed in the meeting and then summarize a brief after the breakout room is open. So
and the leader also makes sure that everybody is heard and we complete in 5 minutes.
Okay, sir. I'm breaking it into 5 rooms right now.
Okay.
Should feel that we are not like taking any information from him, but we should feel that he should trust us. That is more important, I feel.
Actually, wait a minute. The groups that got together now, would anybody want to say anything? The other group A, any comments? What was the most important comment made in your group? Who is the leader of group A?
Group 1, sir.
Group 1.
Yeah. We agree with Dr. Annie, whatever she said. We thought that the patient is not, she's thinking about her extreme, like it is about her death. So it's her autonomy and it's her own self. So if at all we want to get something from her, we have to know what is going on with her in day-to-day life. So we have to be like we should not ask directly why you are asking that question, why you are saying why you want to die. If you ask that question, she might not convey what she has to convey to us. That is what.
Thank you, Vasu. Group 2.
We got very good comments, and we had I think a good discussion about the 4 principles. But I wanted to mention one thing, as Dr. Chetan Manohar said, that whenever somebody asks a question which is not related to your field specifically, like you are a general physician and somebody is asking about something related to surgery, which probably you don't know a lot about. So then it's better to guide them and tell them to meet the specialist, or rather than giving your own advice, which since we don't know, our knowledge is good enough. So guiding them towards somebody else so that we don't end up doing maleficence. So that was one comment which was
From
Dr. Chetan.
Chetan, that was very good. I mean, it was not in my train of thought just now, but this is very common. We doctors feel omnipotent. And even when we don't know an answer, we are very reluctant to say, I don't know. And we cook up answers, and now Google tells them the truth anyway. But it's a great strength to be able to say, look, I will have to talk to an expert. I will get you the information. Or at least if you are too busy a person, one of us will get you the information. Thank you, Goraya. Group 3.
Good afternoon, sir.
Who is this?
I'm Dr. Anisha.
Anisha, please speak a bit louder.
Actually, this lady is in a neglected, she state. I think the picture depicts that. So she says she doesn't want to say about dying and all. She may be in a phase of depression. So we have to first analyze what is the patient, what is the motive, why the patient is speaking that. We have to create a rapport with the patient, and then what is the social support she's getting. And all, so that we can, apart from providing the symptomatic care, we should analyze the situations and provide the best supportive care to, and also quality of life.
Thank you, Anisha. Thank you. Next group, that is group 4, right?
Yes, sir.
Gloria, between the groups, we are getting excellent points. You are making a note of that, can you?
Yes, sir.
Group 4. Time is flying. Please come in.
Dr. Annie's group. Dr. Annie, Dr. Bharati.
Dr. Annie already made a comment in the beginning. Group 5.
Dr. Angela here.
Dr.
So,
Angela, hi.
Hi, sir. So while discussing what we came about is, the patient does not want to speak about dying, okay, with your respect to autonomy, but Can we ask her what she would like to speak about and what about her living thoughts? What is the most important points to you right now? So what are the most important points which you want to do? And when she talks about that, she will feel beneficial, because speaking about something which gives you hope is very important. So hope is one thing which we spoke about in our group discussion. And then the thing was we should be giving her the scope to think about newer things, whatever be the dilapidated state in her, of her living. We should give her hope to think positively and move, even if it is for a minute or for a day, to move forward. So that was a discussion which came about in our group. Thank you.
You are all brilliant. This is absolutely fantastic. Actually, confession time. I read something in social media in one of the palliative care groups. This question being brought up. Patient says, really, I do not want to talk about my dying. And the answer that the person gave was, fine, let us talk about you living. Let's talk about your life. I thought that was brilliant. Excellent response. She's alive. She is alive till she dies. And let us talk about how you are living, what we all need to do with the time you have. And that discussion may eventually bring her own thoughts to the death. She is thinking about it. Somebody says, I don't want to talk about dying, is clearly thinking about it, maybe scared about it. And maybe the conversation will build the relationship, and you will come back to that. The point is, if you were blindly respecting autonomy, they say, I do not really want to talk about this, and you shut up. That is cruel exercising of autonomy. Going to the reason behind that and exploring is compassionate thing to do. So we'll
Sir, just want to intervene. We also have Dr. Odette joining with us. She has been part of the breakout room also.
Hi, Odette. How nice, absolutely nice.
Thank you very much for letting me join in. I'm just saying to Group 5 that I'm learning about the whole ECHO program, and I appreciate being able to join. So I participated in the conversation with Team 5.
Raju, has Odette been introduced to the group at some point of time?
No, sir, no.
Odette is a consultant in palliative medicine working in Australia for a long time. We have known each other, to be precise, 22 or 23 years. And she is here as an observer. And we shouldn't waste the opportunity, Gauraya, at the discussion time, especially when we are going to the case presentation. Let us drag Odette in and to share her wisdom. Thank you, Odette.
Thank you. Thank you, Raj.
So we will have this clearly understood that when I am your patient, you will remember that this is my body, my life. And with all your degrees, you do not have more power over this body than me. Having said that, that will have to be exercised sensitively. This concept of normative or ethical relativism means that what is right, good or bad, is determined by society. Odette was originally from UK, and maybe 2 generations before her, the order of the day was spare the rod, spoil the child. Right, Odette? At one time, say maybe in a century back, spare the rod, spoil the child. And now, if you take the rod, the child will call the police and you will be in prison. What the society thinks right has changed. And we cannot stand as islands and say autonomy. This is what I will follow. We will have to understand what the society wants, because the family and the community around are also part of the society. And we must build the partnership. The essence of all that ethics to me is the partnership. Blindly exercising autonomy is bad. Establishing a partnership, still continuing the control with the patient, is what we need to do. But autonomy can be a burden. I am sitting there and saying, Dr. Gauraya, I can't think. I don't want to take decisions. You do whatever is best for me. What will my doctor say? No, 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 no. This is your life. You are master of yourself. I cannot take the decision for you. Actually, there are a lot of doctors who say that. I can't. Your life. I give you the choice. You have to choose. Precisely the way the waiter hands you a menu in the restaurant and asks you to choose. But the waiter usually gives you a recommendation. Sir, this is particularly good. And sometimes doctors don't even do that. This man cannot exercise autonomy, and by forcing him to, you're actually burdening him. You're using autonomy as a weapon, not a tool. If I do not know what to do, doctor, should I have radiotherapy? How do you respond? Gauriya, in one of our conversations, you mentioned about weak paternalism. Would this be a case where you are combining autonomy with beneficence? And weak paternalism in a good way, would it be to say, tell me more and listen to the man, then say, if I were in your position, I would opt for radiotherapy because this, and this.
Definitely, I think this would be a case which is very commonly seen in our country and would mainly point towards weak paternalism, in case where the patient is not able to understand. Usually, doctors do give an opinion, but they give the pros and cons, ultimately pushing the decision on to the patient only. So, again, in this case, the patient wants to choose where they have to go, and again they are like depending on like the doctor is not clearly making a decision for them. He's telling the pros and cons, and it's again up to the patient to decide. So this is comes in like weak paternalism mostly in our country.
So this is what I would do. This is what I would appreciate from you when my time comes. And if I say, I don't know, ask her, meaning my wife, or ask him, meaning my son, that's okay. That's my right. But this is not the usual problem. Usual problem is we have all these discussions. The patient has no autonomy. The family has taken over. They don't very often, with all good intentions, they think because the man has a disease, his mind is not working, and they take decisions for him. So what will you do if the specialist recommends intensive care for better oxygenation, advanced cancer, breathless? The patient cries, don't take me back to that ICU, I don't want to go there. And the son, strong, silent man, don't mind what he says, doctor, we want the best care for my dad. Take him to ICU. What will you do? Raju, will you do that poll? There are two choices. Respect his autonomy. Don't take him to ICU. Or follow the son's instruction. Take him to ICU. The person cannot fight. You can forcibly take him.
So here we also have a comment from Dr. Gajrasraj Raj. He's asking if you give the opinion to the patient that yes, this is the treatment which should be done. So in that case, that would be your personal opinion, and then you may be influencing the decision of the patient by giving your own opinion. So how to go about it in this case?
Gauriya, the weak paternalism that you and I talked about gives us the responsibility to give what the advice that we think is appropriate. Advice is one thing. Taking over decisions is another thing. So 19 people have decided to respect the autonomy. Only one will go with the son. We did not give a third choice anyway. Hey, the 19 people, you really would in actual practice?
Yes, sir.
What age? I don't know what, I possibly this is true for Australia also. In this country, dead people do not go to court.
In India,
In India, dead people do not go to court.
dead people.
People who are dead,
No, they
once
don't.
they are dead. Living relatives go to court.
I remember when I was visiting in Bihar, a lady who was being taken to theatre and saying she didn't want to go. She didn't want to go. And I think she had a septic gallbladder, so it was life and death really. If she didn't have surgery, she would die. But she kept saying she didn't want to go. Unfortunately, she was taken to theatre and didn't survive the surgery. So it caused quite a bit of useful, I guess, conversation about the whole idea of her autonomy, and clearly the doctors were acting in what they thought were her best interests, but these are real issues, aren't they?
Maybe we need to think. We are forced to do things for the family's welfare because they have voice, they are loud, and the patient is weak, cannot fight. Think about me as your patient. By respecting my autonomy, you may be getting into trouble. And maybe, though I appear to be in full possession of my faculty, I may not be thinking straight. It is a truth that if we offend the family, you wouldn't be treating me. They will take me away. This doctor is cruel. Let us take him to a good physician. Maybe what we should do is, I was not fair. I didn't give you all the choices. We could do this. We could continue treatment outside the ICU, including even non-invasive ventilation if it is required, if it is really required. But in an advanced cancer, is this the right decision? You should look at the National Cancer Grid guidelines, which came out year before last. Indian NCG guidelines. One of the important things is, in an advanced metastatic cancer, do not treat people in ICU. They have clearly laid it out. It is not the law, but 150 oncology centers together form the National Cancer Grid. But still we continue to do that. That is mistake number one. Secondly, it was wrong to say, let us take him to ICU. That was wrong. But if that has been said, sit down with the family and say, well, we don't have time now. In communication session, you will go into the details of this. But maybe at this point of time, we will think about alternatives that are acceptable to both parties. Well, the man really needs you, the family with him. Suppose we try to give him in the room all the facilities that he really needs. And I agree, not take him to ICU, but not without offending the family. Because remember, palliative care is for the patient and the family. They also deserve our care. How about answering? Will you try to answer this question? Do I need to give a written informed consent if I am to administer morphine to somebody? Or other medications for that matter. Somebody was saying something, sorry, louder.
No need.
This is the concept of implied consent. When somebody comes to you for treatment, it is expected that you would be giving medications. Unless it's an invasive, unusual procedure, it is generally considered that informed consent is not necessary. But if I am the patient, I know you don't have to take written informed consent, but will you tell me that it is morphine? Or will you just
Yes, sir.
administer the tablet?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Morphine. Oh my God. Why are you giving me morphine? Am I dying?
Communication, sir.
Yeah. So this will not be. Somebody said something I did not hear. You don't have to take written informed consent, but as you said, absolutely, this is my life. I have a right to know. But don't give me morphine like a bombshell. Let us have the proper communication about it and tell me. Help me to understand. If I am scared about morphine, you will have to help me to understand. Beneficence and non-maleficence are important. But they are relative, aren't they? The same chemotherapy, which could be life-saving at one point of time, could be life-destroying when given for somebody who is dying. Did you see that paper from the RCC Hyderabad, where Dr. Sudha and Sinha and colleagues have written that 50% of the patients, children there, received chemotherapy in the last week of the life? That was dreadful. So it is dependent on the aim of treatment. We cannot do always good. We cannot avoid harm completely. We are human beings. Doctors are also human beings. We can only try to be fair, balance the good and the bad, and try to do the best. The principle of double effect says that all drugs, all procedures may have some adverse effects, even your paracetamol. But you achieve a balance between the good and bad. And that's what we do. Double effect is an accepted principle. We cannot do anything that is totally harmless. And finally, the principle of distributive justice. This man with a head and a cancer, the oncologist suspects that it may be invading into his cranium. He has asked for an MRI scan. He has no money. Pallium India has money. We get money donated by people. Should I pay for this MRI scan from Pallium India funds? If I do, maybe that money is needed for education of 2 children of families who may be dropping out of school. There may be so many other needs. How do I balance this? The same occurs for government. Government often takes decisions about medicine based on popularity. What is popular? Kerala bought a helicopter for organ transplantation. So those things, challenges will be there. How do you solve this problem? Distributive justice, fair allocation of available resources. How we would sort out is, if we are not very clear what's right and wrong, we would have an institutional ethics committee who are able to come together quickly. Hey, here is the question. We had a big issue last week where somebody with an incurable illness still wanted to appear for her examination and wanted the examination fee of 30,000 rupees. This was her one ambition in life. She will not have another chance. I am finding up this with this comment that decisions on ethics may be difficult to take. We may have to put our heads together. And one person, even difficult decisions, it may be wise not to have the decision taken by one person, but not by a committee that will sit for 3 weeks together, but somebody who is quickly able to put their heads together and take a decision. I will not go to euthanasia because that's going to be dealt with in another class, another session. But still, I'll mention that when there are critical, this is the last slide, I'll stop here. When there are critical decisions, you have to take into consideration the facts about that man's need for MRI, about the children's need for education. Consider the 4 basic principles of medical ethics. Ensure societal and family decisions. We need to carry them with us. We cannot fight with everybody. See if it is economically feasible. And certainly we don't want to do anything illegal. All these will have to be balanced. I'll stop there, and in the remaining minutes, Gauraya, can I take it, give it back to you to lead the discussion?
So one more point I wanted to talk about with respect to distributive justice. Like you said, there was this one patient whose sole aim was to appear in the exam. Similarly, we've seen patients the patient is almost end of life, and now they want to take the patient back to their home. So patient has to have an ambulance for it, which might cost like traveling right from Maharashtra to UP or Bihar. It would take like around 50,000, 70,000. So we have donors who are not willing to pay this big amount of 50,000 or 70,000 just to transfer one patient to their home place, while the same money can be used for medicines for n number of patients. So here is another problem that we face with respect to distributive justice. And so we had one question coming in from the participants. Here, the patient didn't wanted treatment, like good treatment for his disease. Like probably the patient felt that whatever is happening, let it happen. But the family felt otherwise. They wanted to go for a very high level, best possible treatment. So here, due to some circumstances, the patient died. So our participants want to know how to handle this. Like this would be a case of autonomy of the patient, or we would take it as a unit, communication, and how to handle this sort of situation where the patient and family both have different opinions.
I would, we will have, we won't be able to deal with this dilemma in great detail. But what very often happens is that you then become the patient's advocate, and then you are in a position of having to fight the family. This is to be avoided. We cannot be on opposite sides of the court. You have to jump over the net and go to the patient's, the family's court and discuss. I will sit down with them. I will express my admiration for their love. Listen, that is such a loving family, isn't it? Isn't it? They are not our enemies. This is a family to be admired. I see that you love your mom very much. I have great respect for that. You want to do the best for them. I also want to do the best for him, her. Let us work together. And I am only giving you the beginning. That's only the beginning. This can be very complicated. Eventually, you will take 3 days and 4.5 hours to arrive at a consensus between the 3 members of the team. Then will come the son from Dubai or the daughter from Melbourne, Australia. All the weary work to do all over again. So do not expect easy solutions for ethical dilemmas, but we need to continue the conversation. And sometimes those conversations bring very worthwhile results. Sneha has asked a question, Gauraya. Recently, I heard that one patient died because of his strong will that he does not want to go to better care and hospital. Family member wanted to admit him to a good hospital. How to handle
So this was the same question.
Same. Okay. Right.
So I had one more thing in my mind actually. There is 2 things. One is non-maleficence and another is non-abandonment. So even they go hand in hand. For example, a patient is on ventilator, and then you don't want to, in case you don't want to do anything bad, but then just because you don't want to do anything bad, you are sort of abandoning the patient. Let it be, or let the whatever is going on, let it continue, and then we don't know. So non-abandonment also comes in, and non-maleficence also comes in at the same time. So what do we do in such a situation?
Thank you for bringing that up. The patient may not follow my advice. The family may not follow my advice, but I will never abandon the patient. If I find that I am in a position where I cannot do the best for him, I may tell him, listen, I see that I am unable to help you. Would you like to see another doctor? Can I refer you to Dr. Gauraya? I may have to hand it over to somebody else, but because it will be difficult for me, but I'll have to keep telling myself, you are not authorized to abandon any human being. Gauraya, Gachasraj is asking about advanced directives and medical power of attorney, etc. Would you be,
Yes, actually, we have a separate session which would be focused on advanced directives, end of life care, and living will, and also euthanasia. So maybe we'll focus on ethics this time, and we can deal with all this related discussion in that session. So is that okay, Dr.
Yes, Gajasraj, yeah. So Gajasraj, by the way, Gajasraj, I have made my advanced directives. I've also discussed with my family and got them to agree. But we'll talk about it in detail. Raju must be getting a bit restless because time is past 4 o'clock. Gauraya, is there another any final question before we go on to the case presentation?
So we don't have any in the chat, but
Okay.
do any of our participants, if they have, maybe we can bring it up in the case discussion.
Sure. Chetan, okay.
Dr. Chetan, it's over to you.
Yeah, next slide, please. Next slide.
Okay, Chetan, where do you work?
Sir, I'm not working right now, sir. I was in Manipal. I've relocated to Mysore recently, about 2 years back. So
Right.
as of now, I'm not working.
Okay.
So this was a 61-year-old man who had a road traffic accident and a polytrauma. Next slide. He was brought to the hospital in an unconscious state with a Glasgow coma scale of 3/15. Basically, he was not responding at all. Next slide. He was unresponsive to deep stimuli. His left pupil was dilated and fixed. Right pupil was slightly dilated, so it was unequal. CT scan showed subdural hemorrhage, multiple intracerebral hemorrhages with midline shift of 1.3 centimeter to the left. HRCT chest showed bilateral pleural effusion with collapse of the underlying lung. Left mild pneumothorax, multiple fractures of the ribs. Patient was a known diabetic and hypertensive, but on irregular treatment. He was not very, he didn't really take care of his health and was not on good control. Treatment done was craniotomy, right frontotemporal and occipital clot was evacuated, and patient was put on the ventilator. Inotropes was started to maintain his BP. His sugar was controlled, and Ryle's tube in place. Next slide. He was a photographer, wife, a homemaker, and both his children, his daughter about 28 years and son 25, both were working, which is the only saving grace in the whole story. Next slide. So nothing really happened post-op. He did not improve in any way. Each day, the doctors came out and told the family that the patient's condition was the same. The family on day 4 was told that he has brainstem dysfunction, which of course nobody understood in the family. They kind of stayed behind technical terms and did not really use the word brain death, which was more likely to be understood by the family. But on day 4, the neurologist asked them whether the family would like to consider organ donation, since there was no improvement in the patient condition. The family agreed for it. And that decision was based on the fact that the patient himself was a very, very generous and a giving person. So they felt that he would like his organs to be used by someone else. But on day 5, the family were informed that his kidney and liver biopsy showed changes that would, and therefore would not be very useful for organ donation. And they anyway don't use the heart for transplant when the patient is more than 60 years old. Now, until this time, the patient family was not really counseled. Nobody really spent time with them. After rounds, the doctor would come and tell them that the patient has no improvement, but nothing really beyond that. But I got in touch with somebody I knew in the hospital, and that person spoke to the neurologist, but that neurologist was not in charge of the patient. But that kind doctor went and looked him up, and he was kind enough to convey to us that if this patient was someone of my own, then I would not continue treatment. But that gave the family some kind of a direction. And on day 5, they signed the do not escalate form. And the doctors told the family to sign the do not resuscitate form the next day, which the family did. But things continued as if nothing had happened. Day 6, tracheostomy was done. Day 7, an intrathoracic drain was put in place. Day 8, by then I had contacted a neurosurgeon who saw the scan and he went through all the details. And he said that there is no point in keeping the patient on the ventilator and continuing him in the hospital. But we didn't know what the alternatives could be. But by then we knew we had to take some kind of a decision. And after reading and after talking to people who have been in these situations, the family decided to take the patient home. But at that point in time, the hospital advised them to hire a cot and a ventilator and a nurse to continue ventilation at home, which didn't make any sense to any of us. Day 9, the family waited because the patient's sister was to come back. She was abroad. And on day 10, we took him home, and the ambulance person was kind enough to remove him from the ventilator. And then he died soon after. Next slide, please. So the main concerns through all this was that I presume by day 4, the doctors knew that there was nothing more that could be done. And all tests, they don't talk about organ donation unless they are very sure that the patient is brain dead. All tests were positive for brain death except for some random EEG activity. There was no spontaneous respiration, but the family had no clue as to how long to continue ventilator support. What should be done to keep dignity of life in place and know what to do that is best for the patient. Next slide, please. So we have a 61-year-old man in deep coma with no improvement in condition for 10 days. Next slide. So these are the discussion points that I thought I would bring up, more for our own clarity of thought, because I suppose for the family, this is the first time that you need to take decisions like this. So what should the family do when the doctors don't explain the patient's condition in simple language, in a language that we can understand, and the prognosis of continuing in that state, what is not really told to them? I'd like your inputs, please.
Gauriya, before you start conducting this session, I would like to tell Chetan, it appears to be a very personal connection for you. Your emotional involvement is very obvious. I am glad that you are sharing this story, though it is painful for you. I want to thank you for sharing this story. Very important story. Thank you, Chetan.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Gauriya,
thank you,
Gauriya,
Dr. Yes, sir.
After the discussion, before the time is over, I would like about 3 to 5 minutes to bring up something, but till then, do please continue.
Thank you, Dr. Chetan, for sharing this and the case presentation. So regarding the discussion points that we have here, especially the first three ones. So does anybody have a explanation, like this is definitely something ethical, but anything that should have been done and was not done, maybe in this case? So does anybody have any suggestions with respect to the first 3 points here? Something related to communication or anything? Does anybody want to say something about it? Let's go one by one. Let's talk about the first 3 points first. I think they are all related to communication. That's why if it could have been done in a better way.
Ma'am, after
It could definitely have been done in a better way.
Right. Anything can you elaborate how could have been like any approach which could have been taken in this case? Or any other suggestion that you have? Anything, any other suggestion that you have?
At no point are we doctors trained to break bad news. So there is one skill which is acutely lacking in all of us because we don't receive any factual training regarding that. So I think if somebody had told them in the steps of breaking bad news, which I think we'll be dealing with later. So if somebody had, if the doctors were versed in that, they would be able to break the bad news better. And the 5 A's of communication could also be followed here. So these are things which we lack acutely.
Yes,
So I think
yes.
that
Very well said. Yeah, we do lack in communication, especially here. Probably things could have been told in a very clear way, very simple way, easy way. And also, I feel that here the doctor may be explaining some medical facts, but then maybe we should also assess whether the relative or the patient is able to absorb that information and understand that the information that we are giving him, and has the capacity to reason, manipulate the facts, and actually understand the consequences of what is going to happen if they refuse the treatment or accept the treatment, or if anything else can be done. So this reasoning ability, if the patient or the relative, to whoever it is being explained, if they have this. So here I think maybe the doctor they just stated the medical facts, but not taking into account whether the exact meaning was being like taken in what they wanted to communicate. Obviously the family is not able to understand the medical terms, so maybe that is one case here. Also along with a good communication skill of explaining it simply and easily. So that is one point I think is common to the first 3 points of discussion, which could have improved the outcome in this case. And
Ma'am,
yeah,
ma'am, shouldn't there be some counselor kind of a person? It need not be a doctor, but a counselor who can come and explain things to the family, because situations like this, they need to understand and know the pros and cons before they take a decision as big as this.
definitely we need to have a counselor. In fact, we do have counselors at many palliative care centers, but again, depending only on the counselor, I feel is not the only thing that is required. The doctor should be having the communication skills as well, because in most of the cases the counselors, they are volunteers, they do not have a medical background. So they might not be able to explain the same situation. Yes, they may be able to handle or the emotional part, or yes, understand the dilemma in which the family is having. But a doctor's communication skills are also essential here, and a counselor, if there, would be of great help. And they are there in many centers. Counselors are also there. So yes, both of the things would be helpful.
Ma'am, can I just say something?
Like, how would you answer the second question? Who should tell the family that when they say each day there is no improvement in their pace? I mean, like, the family members will logically know some part of them will think that there is no hope. But man always lives on hope. So because the doctor's not used the word brain dead, he's used some jargon which I don't understand. So I always live on hope. So who is actually going to tell them that?
Yes, that's what I was talking about earlier, that when the doctor is explaining medical facts or just throwing on medical terms, doctor should be able to assess that, yes, whether the patient is able to understand, assess, and realize the consequences, and it should be there in a simple, very simple thing should be explained, rather than because yes, the patients and the relatives, they do have this tendency, whatever the doctor or anybody says, they want to derive hope from it. So they always see how much is the percentage, whether it is 99%, whether it is like, they even do this in terms of percentage. So I think it is the duty of the doctor to explain it to the patient and the relative, and explain to it, see whether whatever he has said is understood by the patient. Because many times it happens that we are saying something with the patient because of a relative. They have this blockage and they do not understand what we are telling them, and then maybe we have to ask, did you understand what did I say? So maybe this is part of communication skill which has to be better on the part of the doctor.
And
ma'am, I feel
as doctors we feel saying death is something like, it's, I accept it as my failure. So maybe that is why we should be trained to understand that saying that there is, like if I say brain dead, it's not my failure.
Yes, we should be sometimes we do feel that using the word death is sort of failure, but then again, I don't think there is something wrong with using the word death, but yes, it should be said tactically, and not in a way which like crashes the hope of the relatives or makes them hurts them in any way. But yes, sometimes using the word death may make the relatives understand that yes, what the doctor wants to say. Sometimes it is useful, but then obviously it should not be said in a very hurtful way or in some way which is like not good for the relative. So
Ma'am, I feel in such cases, it would be better for the doctor and the team to go take the patient relatives to a separate room, sit down with them, talk to them, explain what has happened to the patient, explain the entire process, the prognosis, and the plan of treatment, what can be done, and the treatment options to the, if it's explained like on paper, diagrammatically to the patient, and like time is taken out properly with the relatives, I think it would have a better outcome. Like,
of course. And this could have been done in if the doctor doesn't have time or the patients are not ready to, a relative is not ready to accept the entire information in one go. This can be done in 2 or 3 or 4 separate sessions because they had like 10 days. So it could have been done on day 1, again on day 2, again on day 3, looking at how much the relatives are able to understand, how much are they ready to accept. So this could have been done in parts. This could have been done in sessions also. Definitely.
We got the feeling that they didn't have time.
Yes, that does happens in a lot of cases, but I still feel that it's duty of a doctor and not only a palliative care physician. Each and every doctor comes across such scenarios, and this is a like very basic communication skill which has to be there. So more than ethics, I would say this is about communication here, which was lacking and which could have been better.
Ma'am, I would like to ask something.
Yeah.
This is not related to palliative care. This is related to this COVID situation. Sometimes when the doctor says, there's not much of when the patient is in the cytokine storm and all markers are elevated and he's, full oxygen and still is, but the relatives don't want to give up. They're saying, no, doctor, keep trying. Do your best. The doctor knows that I will not be, we can't do anything. Then they put him on the ventilator also. So how do you explain this, ma'am? What the doctor can do? They feel so helpless. They don't want to get the patient to ventilator, but the relatives want that, no, you do. I mean, they push us.
So here's is something where the family wants moral duty and the doctor is about arguing about whether to withhold or withdraw the treatment. So it is a conflict between the two. So I feel the basic thing in all these situations is the key to it is communication. And we always see the patient, like what sir said, not as an advocate of the patient. We have to be a part of the whole unit. So communication, which also involves the patient as well as the family of the patient as a unit. So we are talking on both the terms, and when they both have something conflicting or the doctor's decision is something different, so we need to explain the pros and cons, and here is what is paternalism comes in. So obviously a physician cannot be forced to take decision or do something which he does not want to do, but the same thing cannot be put on the patient's head also, because they cannot live with the burden of that the decision they've made. They have to live or die with it. So here the communication is the key, and we need to discuss the pros and the cons and give the recommendations, the best possible recommendations to the relatives, and assess whether they are understanding it, and then ask them to make a decision. Yes, sometimes they will say that yes, whatever happens, we want to put the patient on a ventilator, but then again they have to be told about the futility, and it doesn't happen in one go. Maybe it takes 1 session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions. So maybe it happens over 2 to 3 days, but then the only thing here is better communication. That's what I feel.
Okay.
I would also like to discuss something. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I have been working as an anesthetist in a tertiary care center. I also had dealt with such patients, neurosurgery patients and all, coming with polytrauma after brain death. They may be in the ventilator for a long time. Actually, we may not be having much things to improve the patient's condition. We can still continue that supports for a long time. But that ventilator care, no, that patient, anyway, that patient needs that ICU care. We can't take that ventilator support from that patient because our law doesn't allow us to do that. If we are doing something, we can continue it. That's the main problem. But when another patient comes in, we may have to give the when a patient whom can be served when comes after this patient, we have to spare that ventilator. So we may have to ventilator and bed, ICU bed, and we may be giving the ventilator support for this patient for a long time. But we can't take the ventilator support from this patient. Our law doesn't allow that. And so we may have to explain that to the patient role. And if you are explaining that to the patient, they may, what we usually do is they may give us a do not resuscitate form. So that means that do not resuscitate form means we should continue whatever we should not reduce anything. We should continue whatever we are doing. So that may be the reason that may be the reason this ma'am was asked about this patient, or they were asked to take the patient, and they had asked the patient to arrange a cot or a ventilator at home. In this case, maybe that may be not may not because of the hope, but our law doesn't allow us to take away all these supports. That may be the cause for asking like that.
I do feel that because they were not able to explain it properly, and that's why they they were also bound by law, so they took this a different path and asked the patient's relative to take him home and arrange a ventilator at home. But again, I feel in this case, better communication could have changed a lot of things. And regarding the last living will status, since we have a separate session on it, so maybe we'll discuss the last question. And I feel if this patient's organs were fit for organ donation, yes, probably the need for tracheostomy and the thoracostomy tube, maybe the relatives would not have done it. So here I feel this is more about communication, and then if the communication was done properly, then it comes to ethics about what is the family asking, like their decision after everything has been explained to them. So that's what I feel. And since we are nearing the end of the session, do we have any more questions, any pressing questions, or else we would give over to Dr. Raj Gopal, sir?
I would like to ask one question. Sometimes the patient relative or the patient itself just asks the leading question, as per your experience, what is the condition of my patient, or how will I live, how more day I will live. So in that case, we have to just say the original condition of the patient, or we have to say something which will...
Right. I think this is more about communication skills than ethics, and we should be covering it in the session related to communication. I'm sure we'll be having such, because this is a very common scenario, so we'll be having discussion over it. And is that okay, Dr. Anuj?
Yes, ma'am.
So over to Dr. Raj Gopal, sir.
What an animated discussion. I mean, see, most other aspects of ethics did not attract so much of discussion, because these are dilemmas that we live. These are personal experiences that we go through. The doctors are angry. The patients and families are angry. Everybody is frustrated because of the huge issue in front of us. I have just 1 minute more. I certainly don't want to talk for a long time, but I just want to introduce you this and ask you to think about this. We will be dealing, Raju, am I doing end of life care for this group?
Yes, sir, you are doing it.
Okay. So I will come back to this, but in the meantime, I want you to think about what is our duty. Is it to prolong life? Primarily, do you have a duty to prolong the heartbeat? First, the doctors need to be sure of this. These are all in conflict very often. The family says, no, no, don't give up, doctor. Please don't give up, doctor. Please don't give up. Do we have a duty to prolong life, or primarily more to mitigate suffering? Would the family have the selfish kind of love where they say, I can't let my mom go, which will have to be replaced with, I do not want to let her make her suffer anymore? That is something we will have to achieve by conversation. The society has its own beliefs, and the legal system is confusing. Many of the things that we were said here, the law doesn't permit it. These are not true. There are many inconsistencies about the law, but we will talk about it. We'll talk about these various aspects. But in the meantime, I want you to think about it. Do we have a duty to prolong life at all costs? And very absurd situation in India, where if you agree if there is an organ donation, you can stop everything. If there's no organ donation, the law is not clear. But there is some clarity now. We will talk about that. So, but in the meantime, I brought this up only to ask a request to you to think. Do we have a duty to prolong life at all costs? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll summarize in very short, since we are already over time. So what we learned from this lecture today, mainly the ethics which are around the dignity of the patient. So how do you ensure the dignity? It is by respecting each patient for their qualities and not judging them, not being judgmental, having that attitude, and maintaining the confidentiality, obviously, and also dignity therapy, which can work in a good way by giving the patient think and making them think about what is meaningful to them, how do they want to continue their legacy and their life history, asking about them. So these are few points which we learned in about ensuring dignity of the patient, and the 4 principles of ethics, that is the autonomy, which has to be taken as a unit, not only as a patient, of which an important part is communication and counseling, and paternalism and the complex process of decision making. Also, the beneficence and non-maleficence, which are related and go hand in hand, along with the doctrine of double effect, where we weigh the pros and cons, and accordingly, if the cons are less and the pros are more, we go for a treatment, and the distributive justice. So all these are basically to improve the quality of life and provide a better palliative care experience for the patient. And I thank you all for attending this session. In case you have any questions, maybe we can discuss it in the further related sessions about end of life care and communication. And thank you so much, Rajgopal sir. Thank you, Dr. Odette, and thank you, Raj Lakshmi, for all the conducting this.
So whom do we approach, sir? Like if we want to
Raju, please give